Good evening. Welcome to New Symposium, Civil Discourse in the Pursuit of Truth. Our motto initially was to rescue discourse from the political parties. I like Nancy Gibbs' quote. She was senior editor at Time. Humility makes room for complexity and honors honest dissent. That's the spirit of New Symposium Society. Dr. Russell Fox is the moderator this evening.
Welcome to Immigration Matters. I am delighted to be here as the moderator. I'm going to share a couple of thoughts of my own, and then I will turn it over to the panel. I will introduce each of them as it comes to their turn to speak, after which it'll be opened up to questions from the audience. I want to finish by stating my own priors. Everybody has opinions, and anybody who claims to perfect neutrality on any particular issue, especially an issue as contentious as this, is probably trying to pull a fast one. So since I am technically one of the speakers, even though I am not a panelist, I wanted to share a couple of brief thoughts about immigration matters. I was trained as a political theorist, so I tend to look at questions like this in a rather broad philosophical, theoretical vein. First of all, human beings, in my judgment, are communal creatures. We cannot help but create groups, and that means we cannot help but create borders. This has been the way of human beings since the beginnings of any human civilization. Aristotle talked about how human beings were defined by the fact that they would talk to each other and distinguish that conversation from the conversations that they would have with others. So yes, we do think in terms of groups, we do think in terms of communities, and that means we do think, for better or worse, in terms of those who are in such communities and those who are outside such communities. At the same time, human beings are not just communal creatures, they are also transgressive creatures. We are always exploring, we are always borrowing, we are always inventing. As soon as borders are erected, there are people who want to cross those borders. There are people who want to challenge and renegotiate those borders. And throughout history, all such community borders have always been constantly renegotiated in terms of religion and language and race and ethnicity and history and geography and so much more. So while I tend to approach the question of immigration in a way that assumes from the get-go that borders will always be a part of our lives, I also assume from the get-go that every single border is going to be temporary and is going to be constantly renegotiated as human beings live their lives. Okay, for whatever it's worth, that is kind of how I think about these things, and that is going to probably shape some of the ways in which I will ask questions of each of the panelists. Our first panelist is Irene Cadill. She's come all the way from Kansas City to speak to us today. She is the president and CEO of El Centro, an organization with the mission of strengthening communities and improving the lives of Latinos and others through education, social, and economic opportunities. Let's all give a round of applause, welcome to Irene Cadill.
Thank you. And I appreciate you being here tonight as well. I do have prepared statements because I can go in tangents, and he's only giving me up to 10 minutes. But I want to start out with America. And America is a nation on the idea that all men and women are created equal. So what we look like or where we were born should not identify American, but often it does. Immigrants built this country, and when we talk about contributing members and those folks that we work with on an everyday basis, they're contributing community members, they're working hard, paying taxes, and this is the land that they call home. So for 42 years, El Centro has been working with a population because the archdiocese, a priest in the archdiocese, saw a new language, Spanish language being spoken in the community, and said, you know, we've got to do something. So 42 years ago, we actually worked with a migrant population, actually families that were coming into work and then going back home, wherever they were from. And as we have grown in these 42 years, we've kind of seen those that moved from migrant to then a large undocumented population in the 80s, helped that population in 86 when Reagan allowed a group of folks to go through a pathway to citizenship. So we helped people through citizenship, but what we see today really is in our community a large mixed status family. So might be one, might be two members of the family that are undocumented, but there are definitely a number of citizens within those families and within those walls. So for us, it's important because we've lived through 42 years of a population that has often been fearful, but today definitely has a height of some anxiety. Because my face represents something that the message is saying is wrong or not American. So we deeply care about the American dream for the population that we serve. And we're about expanding economic opportunities and really having a common sense approach to immigration reform. And I guess we'll get deeper into what does that mean. But we really do want to talk about and want to look at a pathway to citizenship for a population that we serve. And that's really important. So I stand before you also not as just but as a nonprofit serving Latinos in Wyandotte and Johnson counties, but we're an affiliate of Unidos US, which is the largest civil rights and advocacy organization for Latinos in this country, who has been working hard in Washington to really help with establishing a common sense approach. Our current system is broken. We're separating families. And for those currently striving for citizenship, it's almost impossible to navigate. And one of the things that I always tell folks is there's not a line to stand in. There's not a way to go back home and do it right. And there's not a line in this country for some of the folks to stand in. But as immigrants, we all come from diverse backgrounds, different places, and the country, it's really about where we call home. So immigrants, regardless of how we've come here, have contributed to our culture and our community. So what we stand for and what we advocate for is that immigrants work for an American dream, that there are 11 million aspiring citizens who not only currently give to our economy, but can boost even more if there was a pathway to citizenship. And then if we also had a pathway to citizenship, it wouldn't separate families. Immigrants start companies and grow jobs, so they don't take away, but they often give to our communities. And also these young aspiring Americans that we call dreamers are ones that are currently in your schools, in our communities, and doing some great things. But what I want to talk about is there's a poet and philosopher from Spain. His name was George Santayana. And he wrote, "Those who cannot remember the past condemned to repeat it." And his argument was that if our world was ever going to make progress, it needs to remember what we've learned from the past. So change isn't the same thing as progress. Progress means taking what we've learned and building on it. But the funny thing about today and what we're going through is that we're forgetting the things rather quickly and that we have no chance to learn the important things from our past. And I'll give you some examples. We have 300 years of immigration policy to get us to where we are today. And the first waves of immigrants into our country were from the European countries, and all of them came economic opportunities, religious freedom, and but during the mid-1800s, Asian Americans settled in the U.S. due to the gold rush, and often anti-immigrant sentiment was discrimination and them coming over to take away their jobs. Does that sound familiar? The first law in 1882 was implemented to ban a specific ethnic group from the United States. Does anyone know who that was?
Chinese.
The Chinese. So we said, and the reason why the Chinese, why we didn't want the Chinese? Can anyone think about it? Taking jobs, willing to work for less, and they're going to lower our wages. Does that sound familiar? So one of the things that happened with Ellis Island opening is that we had 12 million immigrants that came in. We also had legislation that talked about literacy tests and quotas, and even between 1942 and between the early 60s, the Braceros program brought over 5 million Mexican nationals in to work. So all of those things, the couple of things that are more recent include the 86 Act that gave a pathway. But do you remember the 2006 Security Fence Act? $1.6 billion to get 700 miles of fence on the border. So today, the majority of U.S. immigrants come from Asia and Latin America. So if we reflect on some of these past policies, we know that they both positively and negatively influenced our country as well as the immigrant themselves. So they're often guised as strengthening national security, but the question remains, what have we learned and have we progressed? Today seems to be different. Our past shows, even before that, maybe it's because it's happening to us and it's happening right now, but how do we progress? So I appreciate being here today. I'm going to end it by saying the rhetoric, the policies, the hate really won't make progress. What we can do today is to create a healthy, safe, welcoming conversation and community for all. So thank you for having me tonight.
Thank you. Irene, one question. Your presentation talks about the necessity of learning from the past, and you conclude by saying that, perhaps today feels different somehow. But of course, if you look at American history, there have been waves of relatively open and unregulated immigration, followed by waves of tightly restricted regulation, followed by waves of much more open immigration. So given the cycles that seem to exist in history, why do you think today might be any different from American history? Maybe we're just following the same pattern as before? And
I think that's you are absolutely correct. I think we're trying to do the same things. The wall. The money and the discussion of a wall, when you talk about what happened with the fence, all we did is destroy some environment, and we got people to go in areas of desert and actually die. I mean, so we're talking about human lives and we're talking about the environment. So when you talk about this wall, 11 million of these undocumented didn't come from across that border. 40% actually came through visa systems that they just stayed here, planes, trains, automobiles. So it can't be just one thing, and we've not been able to have a discussion amongst party lines. Both are, Obama deported more people than than any of the previous 3 presidents. But it has to come in a way that the discussion has to be open, honest. We too are against those that are bringing in drugs and are criminalizing, but you can't do that to the entire group. So I think there's a discussion around a border security that has to go with a pathway to citizenship, with visas, and restrictions are going to be a part of that. But I think it has to. We tend to just piecemeal and destroy the whole thing instead of thinking about it holistic.
Okay, I appreciate that. We'll now turn the time over to our second presenter, Frank Corrigo, business owner, special projects consultant with the Wichita State University Business Development Center. He describes himself as a serial entrepreneur, and earlier he described himself as the least qualified person on this panel, which means that he has the virtue of being an amateur. So let's have a round of applause for Frank Corrigo.
Thank you. John, I don't know how the heck you talked me into this, but it's okay. I am a business person, and I have been in many panels, usually from a business and entrepreneurship type of perspective. A couple of years ago, I was asked to write a white paper on the subject of a particular ethnic group and the immigration situation in the United States, and I did. This time, I realized that for the last 5 years, immigration has taken a different turn, at least in my lifetime, at least in my adult life. So I realized that I really was ignorant on this topic, that I was being focused on a particular subject that I'm not knowledgeable like my colleague here is. So I decided to educate myself on immigration and what is it about, rather than come out with opinions, try to look at the facts. I do a lot of research, so I use that skill set to look at this, and I'll try to keep an eye on the clock. And so I'm going to take completely not the opposite, but a different approach to what Mrs. Caudillo did. She talked a very specific, going from El Centro and Kansas City and a particular ethnic group and some of the things that are happening in the last few years. I'm going to go and share with you what I learned about immigration and why some things out there shows why we are where we are, and some of the challenges that I believe are real, and perhaps how we can find. I think sometimes there's no solutions, but there are trade-offs in order to come as close as we can to a win-win. So the first thing that I found out is that as a world, as a cosmos in this planet that we call Earth, we are completely out of balance when it comes out to immigration. About every 30, 40, 60 years, there is a major migration or immigration movement throughout the recorded history of mankind. You mean, there was a huge one right after Second World War, and seems like we're experiencing another one right now. It's like Dr. Fox said, is a fact of life. As long as recorded history has been around, immigration even flow throughout that history. So where are we at right now, and why do I say we're out of balance? First of all, let's talk about the type of immigrations that are there. And I don't mean to be condescending, but I had to come to the fact that I didn't realize this was happening. There's different types of immigration or migration. 3 types that I could narrow it down to. One is simple economic, okay? Simple economics. There's a lot of folks from Sweden, there's a lot of folks from France, there's a lot of folks from Germany, Great Britain, Slovakia that want to come to the United States. You know, they're in countries that are, if you want to call them fine, they are fine. You know, they're in a good environment, they're not suffering. They just feel like, hey, I like the idea of going to America and see what I think I can do well there. That is a group of immigrants. That's a group of folks that are trying to immigrate. You know, I imagine there's folks here in America that are trying to go somewhere else. Australia, New Zealand, you know, whatever. So that's one. Simple economics. I want to go to a place where I think I can do better or have more fun or whatever it is. The second group is folks that are under uncomfortable conditions and they lack economic opportunities. We as human beings are wired to succeed. We as human beings are wired to seek, you know, sometimes in a selfish way, but really in a normal way, to do better for ourselves, for our children. Well, there's a group of people around the world that are under conditions that are from mildly uncomfortable to very uncomfortable, and that they lack opportunities. There's a barrier. I think a lot of the folks that you were describing, the Latino population, and a few others on near and Far East Asia, are under that conditions. Really, nobody is dying of hunger, but the conditions are extremely uncomfortable. They're unhealthy, so to speak, and the economic opportunities of advancement are limited. So these folks are trying to come or go to a place, again, where they will be able to do better for themselves and their families. And then there is the third group that I think is the critical one that nobody wants to talk about it either. And that are the folks that are migrating or immigrating simple because they're being displaced due to extreme conditions of conflict. They are under extreme unsafe conditions. We saw that last year with all the folks from the Syria, Somalia, those areas going to Europe, okay? That's a whole different deal, but the world is experiencing these three types of immigration. So we need to understand what we're dealing with. Okay, now, in this playing field, there are there are opposite forces. Every time you go into an environment, there's desires and there are restrictions. There's people that want to come, and there are restrictions to keep them from coming. There are contributions that these populations make, as well as there's detriment. You know, we need to find that balance. And worse than anything else, or better than anything else, there's such a thing as perception and reality. So, you know, we are on balance. We are attacking a challenge that is a normal challenge, and we are attacking it from the political point of view. We have politicized a phenomena that is mainly, of course it's got political ramifications, but is mainly an a social and economic phenomena. But right now we're trying to deal with it strictly from the political point of view, and politics in our nation are extremely polarized at this point. So naturally, immigration falls here. Instead of attacking or trying to find solutions under a socioeconomic aspect, we're trying to find under the political aspect, and we are, as never before, on opposite sides of the fence. And so now it comes to the issue as how can we deal with it as a world, because it's a worldwide issue. We need to deal with the integration of displaced populations, first and foremost. Are we going to have 1 million of Somalians coming over here? That means 1 million of Latinos want. Now, how will we respond here if all of a sudden there's just room for, who are we dealing with? Who are the most needy? So that's one of the things that we need to deal with. The inequality on the destination of the communities. We saw that in Europe. And, you know, as a world, we are not logically and strategically planning the ecological migration that is taking place and will continue to take place, and how we're going to manage these resettlements that are happening and will happen. So I believe that we are in a situation that we are letting our political views trying to formulate solutions that are going to be and complete opposite because of where we are as a nation, rather than dealing with finding trade-offs that will bring true answers to the challenge that we have.
Thank you.
Let's get right into the time.
Frank, one question, and I recognize that because I teach politics, everything looks like a nail to a hammer. So, I tend to privilege the political solutions. But I want to ask you this. Let's set aside your last group, the people that are fleeing situations of conflict, because obviously that has to involve some kind of political determination. Let's look at the previous two groups. Is it really the case that we can factor out political motivations from social and economic ones easily? I mean, I could imagine a situation where someone is fleeing a very, very difficult situation, but they want to flee to a place that will provide economic opportunities. Similarly, I could imagine a situation where someone is seeking economic opportunities, but they're seeking them because they understand that if they become any more successful where they are, they could suffer pretty significant persecution. So it seems to me that at least in the first two groups, you can't really separate out the political from the economic.
I never said that we had to separate it. I'm saying that we need to find that balance. That's my point. We are trying to find a solution strictly under the political, position, rather than incorporate the economic and the social elements of it. That's what I'm saying. We are out of balance. I'm not saying leave political out. You can't, because there are regulations, because there are laws, because there are things that involve government. So you cannot leave the political out, but you cannot, for using your hammer and the nail example, you cannot just try to implement a political solution to a phenomena that involves huge areas of economic and social component. So that's what I'm talking about, finding a balance. The other thing is you cannot leave that group out of any discussion on immigration, and I'm going to tell you why. The expectation is that between now and 2025, there's going to be 65 million folks that are going to be displaced from areas of war and extreme conditions. 65 million, mainly that area in the Middle East and Somalia and some African places. So just because they cannot walk across the border, are we going to ignore them? I don't think so. This is a worldwide challenge. I mean, look what happened in Europe last year. I mean, these folks got to countries like Slovakia or Czechoslovakia that says, we're not even going to give you asylum. We're not even going to let you go through. And they said, yes, we're going to go through. Boom, they killed 300. Okay, we're going to go ahead and go around. I mean, that's how those people dealt with things. So we cannot ignore when most of the immigration in the world is going to come from those areas. And how are we, as a nation that is trying to find compassion in other areas, going to deal with this? So I don't think you can ignore that just because they cannot cross or swim across the river.
All right. I appreciate that clarification very much. Our third speaker is Rabbi Judah Kogan. Did I say that right? Okay. He's the rabbi at Wichita's Hebrew congregation. He is a noted academic within his tradition. He has been on the Bima for more than 15 years, and we're very pleased to have him with us tonight. Let's give a round of applause for Judah Kogan.
I have a number of things to say about the issues that are on the agenda and that have been discussed, but I need to start with a question that I think is probably a pressing one. There must be people who are wondering, why on earth is a representative of the Jewish community asked to speak about the most oppressed people in our society and in our world? And for that, I need to go back to a brief history lesson and talk about what it has meant to be Jewish and an immigrant, let's say in roughly the last 100 years. Most of the Jews in the world, and certainly the vast majority of Jews in the United States, had ancestors who came from mostly Eastern and to a certain extent Central Europe, which were areas where it was not at all pleasant in modern times to be Jewish. Tsarist Russia was probably the most unpleasant place to be Jewish in the 19th century and early 20th century. And before 1880, there was a very small Jewish population in the United States that looked very much like the rest of the United States population. When pogroms which are really a Russian word for race riots, began in Tsarist Russia, large numbers of Jews came out of Eastern Europe, headed mostly for the United States and also to a lesser extent to other Western countries. This coincided with waves of immigration that came from Italy and Poland, which are contemporary with the largest Jewish immigration to the United States. Jews who came here had their own culture, of course, and their own education, but were not particularly well educated in terms of what it takes to be successful in American society. That changed over time. And by World War I, there were 3 or 4 million Jews in the United States, most of whom were first or second generation arrivals. Jews in that wave of immigration came during a period of time when immigration was largely unrestricted. I've heard about the first Immigration Act having been aimed specifically at the Chinese. There were no real restrictions on immigration from Europe until 1924, when Congress passed an Immigration Act which created a system of quotas, left the Western Hemisphere alone. Until the 60s, there was basically free immigration from anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. We saw ourselves as part of our half of the world and as capital of our half of the world and leader of our half of the world, but try to restrict what could come in from the other half of the world. And the Immigration Act of 1924 was a very backward-looking piece of legislation because it didn't set quotas based on the population of the United States in the most recent census, when they still measured ethnic backgrounds in 1920. It based it on the census of 1890. And the point of that was not just people who came over on the Mayflower, but people who were of Northern European ancestry and were mostly Protestant. By the way, I don't mean to imply that there weren't African Americans, there weren't Native Americans, there weren't Hispanics, but they really had no political power to speak of. Okay, so mostly Protestants. The middle wave before the wave I'm talking about was largely Irish, who suffered their own discrimination when they first came, but were already integrated and had some political power in certain parts of the country. The point was not only to aim at future immigration, but also to limit the most recent wave of immigration. So the quotas were based on the percentage in the population in the 1890 census of people who were born in any particular country. That meant that if you were born in Poland, or you were born in Russia, or you were born in a country that was more greatly represented by 1924 than it had been in 1890, you were going to face greater restrictions, whereas if you were from Britain or Germany or Holland, you basically didn't have to worry about a quota. Now that law came at a time when there were, of course, great upheavals in Europe, and there was much more to come, obviously. 1924, you couldn't even predict what was going to happen in the 30s and 40s. The United States wasn't the only country that restricted immigration, but basically the free immigration of Jews from Europe stopped in 1924. Canada imposed even stricter restrictions in 1933. During the Holocaust, the Canadian Minister of Immigration was well known for having a policy that he summed up by saying about Jewish immigration, none is too many. At the same time, when people were trying to get away from Nazi-occupied Europe during the Holocaust, the British issued their white paper restricting Jewish immigration to what was then called Palestine. Absolutely incredible timing. All right, let me tell you a story about the 1924 Immigration Act. My father was born in Poland in 1919. It had just become a section of Poland that had just become part of an independent Poland after the same territory had been Tsarist Russia before World War I. My grandfather left Poland in 1922. He was concerned that there was no future for Jews in Poland or in Europe, and decided to go to the United States. He got here a little more than a year before the Immigration Act. Then he had to wait till he became a citizen before he could bring his family here. That's why my father didn't come till 1928, when he was 9 years old, along with his mother and his late brother. They left people behind who, if they didn't get to Palestine in the 1930s, were martyrs of the Holocaust. My father, to his dying day, had a picture of his third grade class in Białystok, Poland. He claimed, I am the only person still alive in this picture. I don't think he was correct. I think some of the people in that picture may have gotten to Palestine after he got to America, but nevertheless, it's a powerful image. The same is true in other branches of my family, of people who were left behind to an uncertain fate. The American policy in 1940 and 41 and 42 and 43 was, sorry, we have our rules. And it's only after 1945 that the Jewish community began to sit up and exert some political influence. They had been rather more timid before. The United States was reputed to have been more anti-Semitic in the 30s than in the, let's say, in the 50s, and it was hard to take a political stance. But the important thing to remember, a little bit for my generation, more so for my parents' generation, is that anybody could say, look at what happened during the Holocaust. Look at what happened to the Jews of the Soviet Union under communism. If my grandfather or my great-grandfather hadn't come here when he did, it could have been me. And I want to have a chance to talk about what are people running away from now. Obviously, my time is up, but I hope to be able to get back to that in further dialogue. I want to be able to talk about what we can do for immigrants today, and I want to talk about what immigrants can do for us.
Yeah.
Thank you. Rabbi Kogan, I want to use my prerogative as moderator to ask you a somewhat unusual question, and if the question invites you to pontificate a bit, I will give you a little bit extra time to answer this question. I know from experience that a great many of the people who attend New Symposium events and support it work very hard to understand how to bring their Christian faith into their struggle over particular issues. What is it? I mean, you've spoken very powerfully here about history. What is it that your particular tradition can add theologically to a question about membership and community and belonging? with the understanding that, historically the Jews have been, ethnically pretty exclusive, as they've defined themselves. So,
Well, Jews have been in the forefront of not only immigrant rights recently, but civil rights in the United States because of a sense of we appreciate the suffering of other groups, having been through it ourselves, even though it may not look today like Jews are particularly a suffering group. There is also a mythology that Jews take care of their own, which is part of the same way that the Catholic community has Catholic charities and Protestant communities have their own charitable groups. We have Jewish charitable groups as well, not necessarily, not exclusively to help members of the Jewish community, but we are concerned for people of our own community, and we're especially concerned about members of our community overseas, which is why the lobbying and the demonstration for Soviet Jews in the 60s and 70s was really second only to support for Israel as a social issue among Jews, and thankfully it was successful. There's a fairly good representation of former Soviet Jews in the United States and even more in Israel today. The biblical tradition, and I've got to add that not all Jews are necessarily sympathetic to people of other groups, but we're supposed to be. The biblical tradition is to treat foreigners fairly, to treat strangers in our midst well, to make no distinction between strangers and our own. And it's very clear that no matter how exclusive membership in the Jewish community may seem from a religious point of view, that from biblical times on, there was a tendency to accept non-Jews into Judaism that was only thwarted by the persecutions of Christianity and Islam in the Middle Ages, which made it, you're not going to be out looking for converts when both you and the convert are going to be subject to what the Inquisition has to say. But Judaism has been open to outsiders, or should be for the most part, and I hope sensitive and sympathetic to the needs of people who suffer, whether they're Jewish or not.
thank you very much. I appreciate that. Yeah, absolutely. Our final presenter is Joyce Mucci. She is the Southern Field Representative of the Federation for American Immigration Reform, a public interest organization united in the belief that immigration policies should serve the nation needs. And I appreciate you speaking last, especially since you're probably conscious of the fact that you may be taking a position somewhat different from the previous speakers.
Not quite that much off, but.
Okay, well, let's give a round of applause to Ms. Joyce Mucci.
And I appreciate the comments from the other panel members. And our position is simply that, like every other sovereign nation in the United States, the United States has the unfettered right to determine who and under what conditions anyone comes into the country, which is fair. Every nation in the world does that. And a successful implementation of immigration policy preserves the rule of law, which is here in the United States now, protects our sovereignty, and promotes the interests of the American people, and are dependent on a carefully crafted strategy for securing our borders and controlling access. I'm sorry.
No, just move the mic.
I'll just talk louder. Can you hear me now? Is that better? Okay, great.
Okay.
The American people are dependent on a carefully crafted strategy for securing our borders and controlling access to the interior. The sovereignty of the United States should not be a new concept to anyone. Western civilization has flourished because of the rule of law, the inherent right of nations to defend its borders, and to institute immigration laws and policies that protects its own citizens. However, in the past 20 years or maybe longer, there have been people who have ridiculed our idea of national borders. They have insulted the fact that we have national borders, and they have undermined the exercise of these national borders, including terrorists and others who have violated our laws. So we need to ask those, whether it's people outside of the country or even just in the country, and this is a legitimate question. We need to ask those who maybe aren't on the same page as my organization is on, but that we need to have policies and conversation about policies that would protect American lives, help prosper the American people, and improve the upward mobility of legal immigrants and the most vulnerable. Should the priority of our elected officials be to improve the lives of American citizens or allow corrupt regimes to export their poverty problems into our country? And the second question had to do with, are there extenuating circumstances? Well, of course there are. And that's why the United States has taken on a policy of dealing with those on a case-by-case basis, which is our tradition, at least from my knowledge in 10 years in this issue, on a case-by-case basis. We also have, for example, that members of people who are here unlawfully, even in Kansas City and elsewhere, that they are afforded an opportunity of a U visa, for example, if they are victims of certain crimes like domestic violence and among others, and are also helpful to law enforcement to come and catch the bad guy who did those bad things to him. They may qualify for a U visa. So that's just one area. That's just an example. The other one is regards the admission of asylums and for refugees. There are certain admissions processes and that have to be done, first of all. And I have a friend who actually came here as an asylee 10 years ago. He left the country of Uruguay. His father was the president of Uruguay for 5 days, and the communists came and threw him out, and he fled the country. And so that's a very high bar to step up to asylum, at least from my understanding and from his report to me. And so the other one is the last question was that, is there a win-win solution for everyone in these challenging issues? Well, if there was, we'd have a magic wand and it'd be done tomorrow. It's not. Every situation cannot have a win-win outcome. There can only be better and worse, which is not necessarily the most satisfying answer for anyone. Not today, not 20 years ago, and probably not 20 years hence. But we have to, see, I've got my things all out of whack here. But we have to be realistic about the circumstances in which we're dealing with. We are living in a world with 7.5 billion people. A growing number of them are living in countries that can only be described as failed. The hallmarks of these countries are dysfunctional, their governments are corrupt, they have grinding poverty, increasing lawlessness, and an ethnic or sectarian conflict. Every day, there are people around the world like that. No nation, no matter how well-meaning, can reasonably expect to absorb what is essentially a limitless number of people who are understandably trying to escape failed societies. And they are every day. You've seen it in Western Europe. You've seen it just yesterday and last week coming up from Central America. And this is the challenge. It's not unique to the United States. We are not unique in this issue, as the gentleman here said. We're not unique. Every developed nation on earth is struggling with exactly the same questions and moral dilemmas, which is what they are. What we are trying and failing to do at this point is to deal with the humanitarian fallout for what is a much deeper crisis, far deeper than anything that we hear on the news today. It's far deeper. It would be pure hubris to suggest that we have the capacity to fix problems that are leading countless societies to fail. To say we have the answer to everything, because we don't. And that's the struggle of a free society, is to be able to have this tension where we have to this is good, this is not good. And it would be suicide to try to absorb endless number of people. We can't. I mean, if you had 3.5 billion people, we couldn't absorb everybody. And recognizing our limitations and recognizing that there is no win-win, we need to do what reasonably can do to absorb these situations, especially from countries where are the sending countries or the countries that these people are fleeing from. And instead of trying to absorb endless flows of migrants, the United States and other Western nations must exert economic and diplomatic pressure on the very governments that are responsible for the crisis. Governments are callously neglecting the needs and interests of their own people, and they must be held accountable. Much as we have tried to isolate rogue regimes like Iran and North Korea, we must also sanction governments that loot their nation's treasuries, ignore the basic needs and security of their people, and expect other nations and deal with the human consequences. This approach is not a constitutional win, but we may be able to do that. It's not a constitutional win for anybody, nor is it a win for the United States. We need to be honest with ourselves and acknowledge that it is not good. It is merely better than ignoring the corruption and incompetence of the countries that are generating mass flows of migrants and trying to deal with the humanitarian consequences. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Joyce, I really appreciated you, emphasizing that there's not always going to be win-win situations, and you talked about the tension that exists not just within our own country, but within countries all around the world as they struggle with this issue. I just saw this morning the results of a new YouGov poll that showed issues related to immigration, to the regarding the acceptance of refugees, regarding levels of legal immigration, regarding passive citizenship, about as starkly divided in the United States as you can imagine any issue being. It's very, very close to hard 51-49 disagreements about almost every one of these issues. Mm-hmm. Is the best solution then to try to focus on, small things rather than try to address it comprehensively if disagreement is really this deep? I mean, if the goal of FAIR is to emphasize the rule of law, but there is no consensus on what the law should be, what's the approach that we should take?
I think from our perspective that what we're hearing and reading, and I read everything, both sides of this issue. I don't limit it to what my organization puts out, but I read everything. And I think, as I said in my opening remarks, that there is this disconnect about the sovereignty of the United States, that the American people are the only people that are allowed to decide who can come in, how many, and what the rules are. That's the basis of every Western civilization. However, we can balance that, for example, by having a comprehensive security that not only deals with national security, but interior security. And then after we've put all of those things in place, then we can then have a discussion about an amnesty or a pathway to citizenship. But until the American people are safe, it just seems not a good idea to start talking about an amnesty first with a promise of securing the borders second, or after the fact. And that's where we are. We think that there's obviously tensions that are going on. There's discussions going on even in Congress now. But our position is that the border security and measures that chain migration and others that fuel the number of immigrants that come in, since we have 1 million people that come in a year lawfully, 1 million. And then on top of that, once they move through the process, then they're able to petition for family members to come in. And it's not limited. It's not limited. And so we're dealing with an increase in population, not just due to the people coming in, but including chain migration. And there's got to be some way to balance this, because 1 million people a year is a lot of people. And we don't have the sources anymore. We're not a country in the 1700s where we have large swaths of population or land mass where we can build on. But I don't know if that answers your question or not, but it does. We think that border security and interior enforcement become more important first, and then we can start talking about an amnesty or a pathway to citizenship.
All right. Thank you very much. Now, what we are going to do is we have a little more than 45 minutes to take questions. As I emphasized, anyone can ask a question directed towards anyone. However, I am going to expect that any question that is asked be asked in 1 minute or less. And so we will start. And
Is there any way I can make a comment?
well, okay, so
Okay.
do you want to ask the first question? That's
I just want to quickly respond and understand, when you talk about border security, how much do you need for border security when, the technology's there, the people are there. Since 2009, migration in that border really has been net zero. The large amount of people that you're seeing come in are ones that are seeking asylum, which they're going to the proper border to ask, and they're not being given asylum or given that process. So the process is not even happening. So they're taking a path that we created in those deserts and those where they're trying to survive and end up dying. So when you talk about border security without anything else, I have a sense of the U visas aren't signed at a local level unless they lead to prosecution. So in reality, anyone could that is eligible for U visas aren't even getting them at a local level to be signed to move in. The chain migration issue, if you petition a member, you're talking about 20 to 30 years. It doesn't happen immediately, and it doesn't happen overnight. We have people in our community who are dealing with a 1989 petition for their son, daughter, mother. It's not happening overnight and in that drove that you're discussing.
No, I agree with
Because-
you. The people that are waiting in line overseas, you're right.
Yeah.
They're waiting too long, but we shouldn't bump other people up.
It-
Ahead of that
but
line.
But none of that is happening, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Right.
We don't follow our own processes for people to do it in an appropriate way.
Okay.
Go ahead.
No, thank you for that exchange, and I'm sure there will be others. Let's see. In green, your question.
Hi, my name is Janet Bradley, and I'm a master's in Spanish literature and Latin American civilization. And you said you read a lot, and I would like to know what perhaps you have read about the history of U.S. involvement in Latin America, and in particular in Central America, that have driven the problems to create these refugee situations today. We have a 36-year war, civil war in Guatemala that began with the overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954 by the U.S. CIA. There's numerous examples. El Salvador really was the war. Right now in Guatemala, as I mentioned Guatemala, I'm sorry, Honduras, the coup d'etat in 2009, which our government supported. These things drive immigration. They create chaos in society. Have you read anything about those years?
So Janice, was that directed to Joyce? Okay. Joyce, if you could answer.
You know, I'm not a history major of the Northern Triangle of Central America. I'm not. But I will tell you this, that today, those nations, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, have a responsibility because we give them foreign aid to help the issues of young people. Vanderbilt University just did a study on this in 2013. This is what I read yesterday. And so I'm sorry, I don't. So the governments that are now duly elected in place, however we perceive whether they're doing, they still have a responsibility to their own people. That's not our fault. when we're actually giving them foreign aid. They have a responsibility to the poor and vulnerable in their own country.
Look at.
Let's
No, I mean, you're right, I
let her
should study
finish
up
her
on it,
answer.
so I'm sorry.
Do we have another question? Oh, hold on. I've already called on him to.
Go ahead.
Okay, go ahead.
I think the main thing that's missing from immigration history, if you'll remember, prior to 1964, immigrants came over self-sufficient, or else they had to live off of somebody else. It wasn't until 64 that the public dole became their domain. And so since then, with these welfare agencies is where we're getting in trouble with immigration. So my question is by Irene. So how much treasure do we give in blood for the loved ones we lose, and the public treasury we give out for these illegals that come into the country?
So
Irene?
you're assuming that those that we serve receive benefits from the government.
I know that the Somalians do that we bring over.
Those are
Anybody who's a refugee.
Refugees are different than those that are
You just said
undocumented.
they're trying to come into refugee status. So they're going to get the same.
Asylum
Same
asylum.
thing.
Asylum is not the same as a refugee status. Refugees actually are vetted and do come in with a appropriate process to be able to move a pathway to citizenship. They have like 5 years to become naturalized. They do receive automatic benefits. They do automatically. Asylum, it's not that asylum cases can go on forever. And, but, you know, this image of people coming over and receiving benefits, none of the folks that we serve are eligible for any type of benefit unless it's an emergency, Medicaid for pregnancy that we hardly ever see, and the education of the undocumented children that are here.
That's a benefit.
That's a benefit. That's, I mean, but
Did you have
but
a
not-
question you wanted to ask
not
there?
government. And that was a Supreme Court decision from just in 1982, that was decided, that basically you had a number of undocumented here who were not going to school, we're not educating them, they're here, what are we going to do? The appropriate thing was that public education would be. So that's the biggest one, that's the biggest issue. But
More than that.
not the folks that we serve, because they're not eligible. But I hear that a lot. But our folks pay taxes. Our folks, you know, and I'm not just talking about sales taxes. I'm talking about we help them get their individual tax identification number, because the IRS is the one who says if you're a guest in this country and you're working, we want your taxes. I mean, we want our part of it. They'll never see it. So we don't give benefits that are not eligible. We don't enroll. We do a lot of voter registration. We don't do that. We don't have them work if they're not eligible. We help them follow, but we try to see if there is a pathway that we can try to get them through. We will do that, but we don't enroll them in eligible benefits.
Rabbi Kogan.
One of the characteristics of American history is that there have always been people who are established in this country who look at newcomers who come here for the most part poor and uneducated and say, these are people who are at the bottom of the economic scale. They're going to drain our resources, and they're going to take jobs away from otherwise worthy Americans. Usually that has turned out to be wrong. Immigrants usually come to this country, almost always come to this country, with motivation, with a willingness and an eagerness to work hard, to better their economic situation, and to work their way up into society. And every one of the groups that over the years has been looked down upon as a menace to our society has eventually become a successful part of our society. What's interesting to me is that there are political elements which would rather keep people out of the economy than integrate them into the economy and pay taxes and help literally make America great again. It's unfortunate that we complain, oh my God, Social Security is going to run out of money in another 10 years. You know what?
But that's-
Let's get more people paying into Social Security.
Whoever, which they are paying into and will never see.
All right, thank you. In the very back, you had your hand up earlier.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Could you speak up a bit, sir?
Given the parameters of this symposium. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
You won't get
Okay.
an argument from any of us.
That means we don't have to do applause at the end, because
There you go.
we already did it.
There you go.
Okay, let's see. Right here, in the purple and flowery blouse. Yes. Okay.
I actually have a question for everyone in this room. Where did your people come from?
Well, do you want to direct that to the panel in any way, or?
All of us are immigrants. All of us are descendants of immigrants.
All right. Well, behind you, there, sir, right there.
So Frank, you used kind of a common economics trope. There are no solutions. There are only trade-offs.
No, that's not what I said. In many situations, and this particular seems to be one where it'd be hard to find a win-win, but we can find trade-offs in order to come up with the best
Did you want to?
outcome.
Could you identify some of those trade-offs as you've seen them, as you've been doing research?
Okay, let me back up a little bit, and I've been biting my tongue because I feel like I took the wrong approach, because I was trying to take a holistic thing on immigration, on the world. I want to talk about a lot of things, like what's happening in Germany, what's happening in France, countries that open their borders unwisely, in my opinion, to these folks, and now they're suffering serious consequences. But the reality is, on the other hand, there's going to be an estimate of 65 million of folks that are going to be displaced. And as a world, as a planet, we're doing nothing. Just like the plastic, and I don't want to be I'm not a tree hugger, I'm not a granola head. I'm just saying there's a lot of things out there that we are not approaching strategically. So let me tell you, about 2 years ago, a group called the AFP, I don't know if you know who they are or how you feel about them, that's not the point. They asked me to come up with a white paper on exposing some of the challenges that are affecting, the Latino population and some solutions from the business economic standpoint. And there's something that nobody's talking about, and you're going to have to put up with me for a little bit. Mm-hmm. But the reality is that everybody is talking about some 11 million undocumented illegal folks that are out there and how we're going to integrate it or not. The reality is we cannot put these folks in trains and ship them down. We might as well put a swastika on our arm. The other hand is we cannot let this go on. We got to come up with, first, we gotta control the influx. We got to control the borders. I'm not talking about a wall, I'm talking about that thing, but I'm hearing what you're saying. Right. We got to take care of that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is there are approximately 40 million of U.S.-born Latino individuals in this country, 40 million, that are economically engaged, that are socially engaged, that are educated, but are not politically engaged. And the reason is the following. Now I'm going to go from the world thing to this particular thing that we're addressing here. It seems to, let's deal with the fact.
Frank, 1 minute.
Okay. Is the Hispanic or Latino population in the United States. Why are these folks that are legally here not joining a lot of these protests? Why are these folks not against or in favor. And this is the reality. The Latino individual, I'm painting with a broad brush, is somebody that comes from a Christian and religious background, that is conservative, that believes in the creation of wealth, okay, that is family oriented and fits exactly with the conservative mentality. But the conservative groups in the United States have been thumbing their noses at us, and we don't care for the liberal message either. I don't want handouts. I don't want welfare. I want to own my own house. I want to start my own business. So what you have here, and that's the thing that is the elephant in the room. There's 40 million folks out there that could vote that are not voting. And that can be a huge difference. And whoever figures out how to make these guys to become politically involved are going to have a lot of things to say. So my answer to you is there are solutions out there, there are trade-offs out there that are not being sought. Everybody's talking about this against that.
He raises, I have to throw
Real
in
quick.
one thing, real quick. 800,000 Latinos turn 18 every year. He is absolutely right when it comes to the conservative part. If Republicans need to start thinking about how to get the message to our population. But there's some reason why they're not involved too. There's fear and anxiety because there's someone in the home. But what I will tell you, Latinos are young, and the growth and the browning of this country through Latinos is not because of immigration, and it won't be in the future. It will be because of the children that they're having. We got to pay attention to that growth.
Okay, back to the audience. Right here, ma'am.
Well, I have a very good friend, a Latino friend, who was here illegally and married a Latino who is legal, was born here, and is a U.S. citizen. She went back to Mexico, lived with his grandparents for a little while, filed all the papers, came back in legally, and is now a citizen. I went to her citizenship ceremony. She does not like what's going on because she did it the right way and is a U.S. citizen, and she resents, as I do, people who come in here illegally.
Is that a question you're directing towards someone?
So hold on. And again, this is not what we want for the folks that come in. The average folk that group that we see has been in our community for 20 to 25 years. The average undocumented person who we see has been in our community 20 to 25 years. If they were eligible to go back, we would definitely help them get there. But not everybody has that ability to go back to straighten out paperwork and do that. And I understand, and I do. There's a lot of Latinos that don't agree with, again, remember, understand that, we're not all the same. We're homogeneous. We're not homogeneous that we think the same and we agree the same. But there are people that have that ability to do that. And we say do it, but not everyone has that ability to be able to.
Education earlier.
So are you asking a question now?
Well,
Okay.
kind of.
Okay.
We just had a Supreme Court decision here in Kansas again that we're not properly funding our schools. And yet we do have an awful lot of, as you pointed out, we've all talked about, children here who are going to our schools, and they should be, they're here, but it's a
They
big
need to be
conundrum.
educated.
What do you do?
We do.
Okay, may I answer that question?
We do as an organization what we know is right for the population that we serve, and we're serving them, and we're asking them to go to school, and we're asking parents.
We have a couple of people who want to answer that, Frank and Joyce, so let's keep the answers
Let me tell
quick.
you something about education. This is the most ridiculous thing. 62% of the state budget goes to education. 62%, 62 cents of every dollar. Has nothing to do with immigrants. Has to do with how the money is being used and judges making law instead of interpreting law. Okay? This is the situation. We are taking 62 cents about every dollar and putting it into education. They just ruled another $1 billion going into education, $500 million in 19 and $500 million in 20. Where's it going to come from? I don't know, because 62% of our budget. 62% of our budget. You try to run your household. You try to run your business, taking 62% to your budget to one single item, and you will not make it. Yet in Kansas, that has nothing to do with immigration.
Frank, if it has nothing to do with immigration.
Lawsuit that they allowed
Frank,
to happen.
okay, if it has nothing to do with immigration. Did you have something you wanted to say about that,
No,
Joyce,
I
real
just-
quick? Frank, you're done. Okay,
I just wanted
Joyce?
to say that the Supreme Court decision that Louise, am I saying your name right? I'm sorry.
Frank. My name is Frank.
No,
Oh,
Louise,
Irene.
right.
All right.
Irene, that
Did
it
I
was
say
the
it right?
Plyer v. Doe
No, what's your
decision
name?
that had to do with,
Yeah.
and it was a decision that was started in Texas. And there is a responsibility. If people are here, and that was the court's sense, is that if you have children, they should be educated, because if you don't educate them, then it's not because they can't contribute, it's just it didn't seem right to do that. However, now with 11, 12 million people who are here unlawfully, there wasn't that many in Texas in 1986, because it was right about the time of the amnesty that happened under Ronald Reagan. But now there are school districts with an enormous population, and it's costing school districts a lot of money, so that's what I just want to say.
Okay.
Not in
Enormous
Kansas.
population.
Let's go to someone else. Mike, right here.
Mike Code, retired elementary vice pastor and teacher of English as a language.
Speak up so everyone can hear you, please.
Forget my name. I'll ask the question. To everybody, to the panel first. Security, the word security is mentioned time and time again. In the immigration debate, in the issue of immigration, from wherever. And my concern, and I would just like your response on this, and it's a political concern. You're a political guy, right? Okay. And immigration is a political issue. My concern about security is the present administration, the president and his administration. They make me feel much more insecure the way they're handling the issue than the immigrant or migrant population. I'm much more insecure about our leadership than about our brothers and sisters coming into the country. Is that a question?
So your question for the panel is?
Could you respond to that?
I just think that the image of what's being talked about for a population that we serve on an everyday basis, I don't see it. I see hardworking, I see educated, people that this is their home, and so I think the message is often fearful and high anxiety. And I agree that our folks, it's not about a national security. It's about, receiving, welcoming, and safe communities.
Okay. Frank?
I'm in the wrong place. And this is the deal. I'm coming back to the issue of balance. And with all due respect, Reverend, is that correct? You're a minister, Reverend. I'm a Christian and believer in Christian law. But you have to balance compassion with safety and what makes sense. I am compassionate, but I'm going to tell you that nobody, I don't care how needy they are, unless an extensive process is going to come into my house and live there, just because I have the ability to feed them and house them. Of people that come out of work release or people that are living in the park, I'm not saying that I'm not compassionate towards those folks, but you are saying that security is almost irrelevant when it comes to who's going to come into our house.
Well, he actually just asked your
Yes.
response
Yeah.
to
Okay, well,
the
my
concerns
response
about
is
security.
it comes to balance.
Okay. Rabbi?
All right. There are, as I see it, three basic responses that have been taken to, I'm going to leave aside the Central American issue for a moment and go to the Middle Eastern immigrants. Basically, three different responses over the last 2 or 3 years to refugees from the Middle East. And you know, if you know anything about what's been going on in Syria for the last 8 or 10 years, you know that there are people who are under extreme compulsion to be anywhere but Syria. The Europeans were indiscriminate, primarily led by the Germans. They let in anybody that wanted to come, basically, and they've had problems with that. The United States talked about being generous to refugees during the Obama administration, and has talked about not being as generous to refugees during the Trump administration, but really hasn't done very much either way for Middle Eastern refugees. The Canadians have integrated Syrian refugees generously and safely. And the question is, what are the Europeans doing wrong? What are we afraid of? And what are the Canadians doing right? During the Holocaust, one of the impediments that I didn't mention before to Jews getting out of extreme danger and getting to a safe country was that you have to, if you're going to be an immigrant somewhere, you have to be able to produce a police report from every community where you lived in the last 10 years saying that you were never in trouble. Good luck getting that from the Gestapo. All right? That's not the only way to be sure that people are safe. We don't do a good enough job, and I can tell from the traveling that I've done in different countries that our border services are simply not as good or as well trained as other countries. And we can do better. You can tell whether somebody coming out of Poland in 1943 is a Jew who's running away from the Nazis or is a Nazi spy. You ought to be able to tell the same thing for somebody coming out of Syria, or whether somebody coming out of Central America is really fleeing for their life or is a gang member who's coming to make trouble. We ought to be able to tell the difference, and we ought to be able to do a better job. And it's not barriers; it's good intelligence and good police work. If we can't do that, we have a bankrupt border.
Okay. I gave you a lot of time there. Okay. Just the response to the general concern about security.
I understand completely. And a friend of mine told me, because I was living in D.C. on 9/11. I lived 5 miles from the Pentagon. And when he came home from work that day, he said, we're going to have to balance your position between freedom and security. And I laughed at him. I said, oh, we don't have to think about that. But he was absolutely right. He was absolutely right. So that's why we instituted Real ID. That's why we just started the Department of Homeland Security. That's why we had, red, green, and yellow, whatever it was. And that's why I wasn't able to fly for 2 months for my job, because you couldn't get on an airplane. Airplanes weren't flying. It was at least a month. But, and I think that I understand why you feel that way. I don't feel that way. I feel like not because of Donald Trump, but I've always been, I believe that the United States government has put in, especially since 9/11, has put in some things in place. Have somebody fallen through the cracks? Yes, the Boston bombers. They fell through cracks. They went back to a country of which they claimed they were being religiously persecuted, but they went back there. One of the young men went back there and came back. And that's how that happened. But we do have security things in place and it's not just the border. It's interior enforcement. And as the rabbi said, it's good intelligence work. It's cooperation between the federal government and local police officers. That makes me feel better. So
Okay.
I don't know if that answers your question or not, but.
All right, we got a lot of questions out there. I'd like to ask a young person. No, plus you've already said something. Right here.
We should have Israeli security.
What's that?
Seriously.
I would like to ask an outwardly young person, not a young in spirit person, but an outwardly young person. Right here.
My question's for the rabbi. You've already touched on like the history of Jewish oppression, and you kind of touched on in your last response. How do you, or what is your thoughts on either reforming or just how things are going now with the raids by the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and also what we've seen recently with the family separations at the border? It kind of harkens back to the Gestapo or the black shirts. How do you think we avoid going down that dangerous route of fascism?
Well, we have to enforce our laws, but we have to be smart about it. We have to do it the right way. There are all kinds of reasons not to separate families at the border. And the administration, I think, recognized that relatively quickly, not quickly enough. There has to be balance in everything that we do. But the rule of law is fundamental to our society. But what really made America great was compassion and opportunity. There is a tendency to say, oh, we really don't have the resources to absorb that many people. There's no way that we can really handle, and we obviously can't handle everybody in the world. There's no question about that. But let me give you one historical analogy which has nothing to do with our country. In 1939, when the British issued their white paper restricting Jewish immigration to Palestine, they were based on the report of the Peel Commission of 1937, which said there are today 950,000 Jews and Arabs in Palestine combined, and the country has a potential for handling 1 million people. So therefore, we're going to restrict immigration to another 50,000, 10,000 over the next 5 years, and then it's over. Okay? The same year that World War II started and the Holocaust began. Incredible time, right? How many people do you think live within that same territory today?
Billions.
12 million. Most of them are doing pretty well, right? So the potential of what can happen when who would have thought 100 years ago that the United States could support 300 million people?
320 billion people.
Whatever.
Yeah.
The numbers have grown geometrically, and we always manage to find the resources to do it. There are other countries, as has been correctly pointed out, who are awful to their citizens, and I wish we would spend more of our energies on getting into those countries diplomatically, economically, maybe even militarily, to restrain some of the abuses of some of the countries that essentially force their people to come trying to find asylum in our country.
All right, thank you. Let's see, you've been waiting patiently up there in the back.
I'll try to be
Good.
We have, in this country, people live in Miami, in New York, along the coast of California, the Gulf states, Louisiana, whatever. What are we going to do when those people have sea level rise to the point that they're moving out of their homes? Where are they going to go? Are we going to open our homes to them?
Is this a question directed towards the whole panel?
I think we've got some bright people up there. Maybe they've got an answer. There, but for the grace of God, will you or I?
How are we going to solve immigration from within the United States? Yeah, from within the United States.
From within this. Americans trying to find a safe place to live. They're flooded out of their homes. Where are they going to go?
Okay, so let's not add climate change to an already contentious discussion.
Seriously,
But if somebody has, I'll go to the whole panel. If somebody has something really quick to say about resettling people within the United States and the movement of people within the United States.
That's why so many people are moving from Africa.
You already asked your question. You don't get to double dip. Okay.
Let me just say that the places you're talking about have been perceived for quite a long time as the most desirable places to live in the United States. If sea levels rise by meters, everybody's going to say that Kansas is the greatest place in the world to live. I don't know how climate change is going to be solved. I have faith that it will be solved. My dream is, if there is too much water in the ocean, let's figure out how to desalinate it, pour it into deserts, make them bloom, and change the world for the better.
Okay. He answered, so you've got to answer. But let's keep it.
Going back to the macro level, when I started, one of the major issues that we have to deal with regarding immigration is the lack of planning that exists right now for the ecological migrations and patterns of resettlement that have to take place. So the answer is we need to do it at the macro level, nationally and internationally. Find solutions, because it doesn't have to do only with the climate change. There are communities that are suffering versus others that are not getting, because get too much immigration or don't get enough. That's the reality of the right balance. Folks, it goes back to the same thing. It's a matter of finding balance and the right trade-offs.
Okay. Another student up here.
Earlier it was stated of having the security to manage the people that come in, and also the amount of time that it takes for people to legally immigrate into the country, and how it seems like it's too long. It's directed to the ends of once we have the security of the border nailed down, what are some ideas or the processes of immigration that protect the types of people that are coming in, and reducing some of the time so that they aren't tempted to take a quicker route through illegal ways?
Do you want to direct that towards a particular panel member?
You said the ones, two of them.
Okay, so Joyce and Irene, how about you go first this time, and I'll follow with Irene.
That's a very thoughtful question. And I know just recently in Congress now, they're dealing with the Congressman Goodlette's bill, which has many areas of it that are pretty good, in border security, e-verify, ending of chain migration, and so forth. However, it's sandwiched in with an amnesty for about 1.8 million or more people who are here unlawfully. And that's what I'm talking about. If we just had a bill that had to do with that interior enforcement, as well as enforcement on our points of entry and on our borders, and we saw a process where that was working, then we can have a discussion about the people that are already here, including, for example, the 1.8 million that they're projecting, but it could be more. But nobody knows. And I'll let Irene.
The 1.8 million are the dreamers, those that we've already invested in the education, who brought into the country and want to be able to participate. And again, this amnesty versus a vetted process that we would gladly accept, whether it's paying fines, but again, they're already paying taxes, already doing what we have asked them to do, to really strive to be successful in either a career path or education. I agree that there are there are some things that we could take a look at, and we're willing to do give and take. But what we've seen is hostage based on, if I don't get this, then you're not going to get this. And I think that the security at the wall, I'm going to agree and disagree in a lot of ways, that look at the amount of people, the amount of technology. I mean, we've got some technology that's even spying on our own, that's even looking at our own citizens at the border. I mean, there's a lot that has been done there, that billions and billions of dollars, and right now, I don't know what we're protecting. We're keeping people in Mexico. I mean, that we're keeping people in Mexico, that's fine, because they're not coming. The job-related, all of those things, it's the asylum cases. So I think there's a lot we need to talk about and balance. I'll go back to that word because there are some give and takes, and right now it's become very
Can I ask a
political.
question to the audience?
You want to ask the audience a
Yeah,
question?
a question.
Okay, but I'm not going to give them all a chance to answer,
No,
though.
that's fine, but it's.
Is it a rhetorical question? Okay,
little bit.
a rhetorical question.
Do you understand, do you know exactly what amnesty means in a immigration-related topic? Do you think that it's equal to citizenship? Is that how you understand it?
It's not.
Is
It's
exactly,
not.
is
It is
not. It's
It
the
is
first
not.
step of a process. I agree with what she has said, mostly now. My only comment, and I'll hurry, is the dreamers would be incapable to function in the countries that their parents came from. And as she says, there's a lot invested in them. These are individuals that are capable of becoming positively economic individuals in our society.
They are.
And
They are.
and they need to follow a process. If they fail, they fail.
Right.
But let's balance compassion, common sense, and the ability to enforce the law of our own country.
All right. Thank you, Frank. We are getting down to the end, and I would be actually drummed out of the university if I did not allow one of my former colleagues, Dr. Gretchen Ike, to ask a question. Actually, I really would be drummed out of the university. They're tight on that. Seriously.
I have a concern about the $1.84 billion that we're spending and detaining immigrants now. And I have a concern about the new changes that ICE is proposing. ICE has asked the National Archives to allow it to destroy records of sexual assault, of people who have died in detention, of people who are in solitary confinement. They are shredding documents now. And this is something that is deeply concerning to me, because I think when you talk about corruption, yes, there is corruption in the governments from which people are fleeing, but there is also corruption here.
Well, I'd like to know, do you have a,
Okay. Do you want to turn that into a question?
Into a question. Are you concerned, and what do you see as a solution to getting corruption out of our system? Because we have a system where we have a lot of kids that may never see their parents again. I mean, we don't, even though we have the technology, it's not being applied.
Is this, okay, so is this going to the whole panel?
Yes.
All right. We have about 4 minutes left, so this may end up being our last question unless you all are super fast. Let's start with Irene and move on down quickly.
So-
Thoughts about
So-
dealing with problems in our own enforcement of laws?
And the separation of families didn't just happen when we heard about it. This has been long-term, and we have some here actually in Topeka. We have a few, and these are privately run. So the lack of government inspection, the lack of ability to be able to place them in appropriate homes, and again, the ability to be the language and culture. This is hard for me because this is such a touchy and sensitive issue with me. So what I will say is they're privately run. They're treating these kids like criminals, just like they're treating the population that we serve, which are not criminal. And we are definitely trying to do something about it. That's all I'm going to say about our organization.
Frank?
The whole thing that you brought up, I think one thing that our country has always been pride in is transparency and the ability to the constituents to ask for answers and get them. So I think the answer is continue to follow what we have, the rights that we have been given by our Constitution, and ask the right questions through the right things in order to get transparency to see if indeed what you're saying is happening, and put a stop to it.
Corruption in a U.S. government agency? I'm shocked. The real problem is that in this particular instance, we're talking about abuse, to the extent that it occurs, of people that have no voice. And that's the most difficult situation to get a handle on. And I'm sure there will be a great deal written about it after the fact, and what could have been done or should have been done, or what happened in the past. It's unlikely to be as effectively treated as the grievances of other constituencies in real time, and that is a shame.
Okay. And Joyce?
There's two things that I can offer as resources. The New York Times article from July 7th of 2014, during the surge of Central Americans. It has to do with the Wilberforce Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization of 2008. This specifically dealt with the trafficking of human beings, in particular unaccompanied minors coming from Central America on up. That's the first thing. And it was a problem for President Obama as well.
Yeah.
The second one is the Flores Agreement. And you can go to Vox.com, and it's Dara Lind and Dylan Scott. This gives you a very good rundown of exactly what the Flores Agreement's about, how it has impacted what's going on at the border. And it has affected both President Obama and now President Trump. So, and I will tell you, when I was down at the border during the surge of 2014, and I was in McAllen, Texas, these young people, there were 5 or 6 young men, probably 16 years old, who were on my plane being escorted by someone either from Southwest Key, which is, you know, a contractor with the United States government to help these young men. And they seemed happy and everything, but nothing, again, it's better, you know, it's not going to be perfect. But the Flores decision agreement and the Wilberforce Act is really worth reading about.
Okay.
And the New York Times is a good article about it.
Thank you for that response. We are out of time. I doubt that a whole lot of agreement has emerged, but I think a whole lot of listening has taken place, and that's very good. I would like to have the last word be given to Mike Witherspoon, who's really the guiding light behind the new symposium.
The mission of New Symposium Society is to gather panels of diverse opinion and a model civil discourse. Our moderator of this panel has helped us realize our mission this evening.